Hello, I'm Matthew Sylvester, the Curriculum Manager for the IEYC. I'm sitting here with Jan Dubiel, an early years expert who has helped us write these webinars, and Laura James, the Nursery Director at Under One Roof in South London. We are in the setting at the moment in their glorious summer house. Thank you so much, Laura, for allowing us to come, and we are going to discuss the first in the series of webinars around early years assessment. So Jan, if you'd like to guide us through your slides, that would be most appreciated.
So what we want to do in these sessions is to really, in three parts, really embrace and address. It's one of the areas which is probably the most contested, but also probably the most important aspects of what you do as an early years practitioner or an early years educator. And we'll come to this in detail, but assessment is essentially about what you know about children in order to support what they need next. That's the fundamental principle of assessment. And we want to kind of unpack that a little bit and look at some of the dimensions around that need to be explored. So in this first session, we're going to look at the sort of principles of effective, meaningful and reliable assessment. Why do we assess? What does that mean in practice? What do we need to be considering when we're assessment in terms of purpose? And also to look at recording and documentation. And again, we will come to this in detail, but recording and documentation is not assessment. They are not the same thing. And I think one of the challenges we face in early years particularly is an overemphasis on documenting and recording. Now that's not just an issue about workload, which we'll come to. It's also a big issue about how effective you are as an educator. Because if you are continually recording, you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, which is interacting and watching and working with children. So in other sessions we're going to be looking at teacher-led observational assessments, how you moderate and you refine judgments, how you get consistency with the notion of observational assessment, because that is subjective, that is based on your view as an educator, but also why testing children in the way that seems logical doesn't work in early years, and we'll be exploring that, because I think that's really important to understand. And then finally we'll also be looking at how we use the information generated from assessment primarily to support learning, but also how we use that for accountability, for demonstrating progress, and some of those real conundrums in early years that I think we face.
Can I ask you, you talked about the fact that assessment is highly contested in the early years, and one of the things I really like about sort of the guidance that you give is the fact that assessment at its base is getting to know the children in your class better.
Yes.
And that's ultimately, which every teacher does, without even realising it the vast majority of the time. So I think that's quite reassuring for a lot of practitioners, because they're all doing that anyway.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. As an early years educator, you have around about apparently 1,000 interactions every single day, and each of those interactions, I would argue, is both a teaching moment but also an assessment moment, because every time you interact with a child you glean information, you store that sometimes subconsciously, which goes into the construction of the child as the learner and what they know and what they need next. And early years educators are highly skilled at doing that in a very intuitive, almost subconscious way. You sit down, any early years educator, and you say, tell me about the fourth child on your register, and 2 hours later they'll still be talking. You hold, as an educator, you hold this massive information, and you are constantly working actually with that information to support their learning. And going back to one of those first points, that's why recording and documentation needs to be viewed so separately, because you are engaged in this constant process of gleaning information, reacting to it coming out again, using that to ask a question, to put in a provocation, to do a piece of direct teaching, to sit back, to allow it to. You're constantly processing that information all the time. But what I would argue is at the heart of that is the principle of assessment, which is, as you just said, it's about knowing the child. And like with the many things, that is a very simple thing to say, but it is also infinitely complex, because it raises questions about what do we know, how do we know it, what do we do with that information, and those, I would argue, are the central questions around assessment. So in Breadcamp and Coppell's seminal work, Developmentally Appropriate Practice, they talk about these principles that shape our view of children. So for example, they say that the nature of early childhood development is it is uneven and unpredictable and atypical with each other. Some children develop very quickly in a very sort of progressive way, other children take massive leaps and then stop, massive leaps and then stop, and so on. And part of our role, part of the importance of assessment, is to understand that difference in the way of learning and tuning into that individuality, so that when you understand that child well enough, you can work with them in a way that is effective for them. So that's again part of that intuition. They also say very clearly that children's domains of learning, what we might call curriculum areas or areas of learning development, if you use the IEYC, are closely related, and children don't distinguish between them. Children, certainly in early years, from birth to 7, what we sometimes refer to as the kindergarten phase, they exist in the moment, but also they exist with experiences, and those experiences can be multi-curricular, if you want to use that phrase, at any point. So when we're understanding children, we need to understand that although we may see this as a literacy activity or a language activity, the child won't have such a closely or starkly defined view of it. They're engaging with the moment. And the nature of early childhood learning is they will certainly use language, personal social development, physical development, their kind of learning behaviours will all be pretty much simultaneous in everything they do. So our role as assessors, if you like, as assessing children, is to pick out what that is for them, and that's part of the process. We also know that children make progress when the conditions are right, when they have the right inputs, when they are in a zone, a trajectory of development. They make progress, they become more sophisticated, they become more confident, they think more creative in different ways. And again, that is what the purpose of assessment is there to manage. How do we create progress and development in children? We also know, Breadcamp and Coppell also identified that play is an important vehicle for that cognitive development. Personally, I wrestle with the word play because I think it's a very small word for very complex set of behaviours. But what they're talking about is the necessity for children to initiate and lead their own activity. And one of the things I think which separates early years particularly from other phases of development is the importance of that self-led learning, which is sometimes called play, sometimes called exploratory learning, it's called a whole host of different things. But the importance of that, and particularly for assessment purposes, and we'll come back to this, is those are the moments when children lead their own learning or lead their own activity when they most effectively demonstrate what they've been taught. So in some ways, the most effective assessments we do as educators is when children are engaged in their self-led learning. Because when they do that, they demonstrate what they've taught in an internalised way that makes sense to them and has meaning for them. And it tells us as adults that that bit of teaching we did before, or we've been doing constantly, has embedded itself so well, they're now integrating it as part of their everyday activity.
If I could jump in, I think that the IEYC process of learning, highlights the importance of explore activities and express activities. Yeah. And the explore activity is where the adult will support and introduce sort of new concepts, and the express is where the adult provides creative opportunities for the child to express what they have learned. And so, where you're talking there about that sort of where a child demonstrates their actual learning, we would expect that to happen within the express part of the process of learning, because the children will be doing, taking the learning they had either from the previous activity and expressing it maybe across the learning environment, in a different learning environment. So I think, the IEYC very much follows that sort of understanding of children, and where we get the chance to assess them, not only within a teacher scaffolded activity, but also within the sort of child initiated, child led part of the process.
Absolutely, and part of the reason that it's so important is because we know from neuroscience that when a brain makes connections, if those connections aren't meaningful and internalised and owned by the child, they're very weak connections, so they get improved fairly quickly. Brain is very brutal at working on a use it or lose it basis. So when you've taught a child a particular skill or concept or a piece of information or some knowledge, if they don't have the opportunity to then go and use it and kind of play with it, make sense of it, actually it's ineffective teaching. So you might, a very simple example is you might teach a child, ordinal number, they might count to 5, and you do that as a group, and you teach them, you model it, and you show them. It's not until they actually go into one of the areas of provision and start putting shells in a bucket and counting them as they put in, that's the point in terms of assessment. You think, right, that is embedded because that isn't coming from me directly. That is, they've been taught that, but they can see how that works. They can see that by counting the shells, they'll know how many they've got at the end. They can say and so on. So absolutely, those two parts of it are really important. And I think part of the challenge, not just in assessment, but in the whole of early years practice, is getting that kind of synthesis right, because it's a symbiotic relationship. Children pick up and work and play with and explore things they've been taught. But also that comes back again to needing it to be challenged and to be taught to take it forward again.
And just if I could sort of interrupt or add to that, you talked about the sort of developmental areas, the areas of learning and development, and the OECD this year identified that they are mutually reinforcing. The children develop social skills to use language, and through the use of language they develop social skills. And so this children, as you said, children do not narrowly define their experiences based on which learning strand they're in. They're operating across the learning strands when they're in the moment. And we'll talk about that later, about identifying significance, or signifiers as a key part of the assessment.
No, and I think that's important to define, because even though all that is happening as adults, we need to know specific things, or we notice specific things. And I think part of the skill of an educator is being able to pull out a particular piece of learning from what a child is doing, because sometimes in that activity they will do something or demonstrate something they've never done before, and actually it's not unless you know the child that it's really significant. They might use a particular piece of vocabulary, or they might demonstrate a particular skill with a tool. Now, unless you know that child well enough, you wouldn't be able to identify that as really significant. We'll talk about that too.
I think as well it's a really timely conversation in terms of where the children have been for the last 4 or 5 months. So when you talk about a symbiotic relationship, actually we as educators are trying to pull out 4 or 5 months of lockdown, and it was a fascinating and continues to be a fascinating process watching children return, having had the experiences they've had at home. And where as educators we sit with this now, it's different, and it's about really supporting the team to understand the context of where we're at, and not shying away from that. This is exceptional times, and these things in terms of what you observe, the children are going to be different, and that's okay. And then equally some things are completely the same, and because the children are in the moment, so don't overload it. So I think the job at when we talk about those two things, the context at the moment is fascinating to look at it in. But I think time will tell. I think it'll be another 6 months down the line when we can really see the impact.
No, I mean it is. No, I think you're absolutely right, and we'll keep returning to this as a central thing. But the purpose of assessment is to enable you to support the child's development. That is the knowing of the child links to then they know this. How do we broaden, deepen, extend that? And interesting. One of the things that has come out of the lockdown and COVID is. Two things particularly. One is some children's language has improved dramatically, drastically because they've been in a very small one-to-one context with adults, sometimes with siblings who have had lots and lots of conversations with them in ways that perhaps is quite unusual. So there are sort of nursery reception teachers that I've been working with over the past month and in the first kind of return in June, were quite surprised at how dramatically their language had not just sustained itself but extended. On the flip side of that, one of the things that was also noticed was children's social development had almost kind of reverted back. And that was because very often they might not be with other children at all, they might just be with adults, and certainly they weren't with their peers. So it's almost as though they had forgotten to some degree how to interact socially. And for me, those two things really strike me and just reinforce the idea of how much of what we do and how much of what children do is learned behaviour. 99.9% of what we do is learned behaviour. Very little is actually instinctive and innate. So you learn how to socially interact. You have a propensity to it, but it needs to be taught and needs to be supported. And again, this is where the importance of assessment comes in, because that gives us the information to say, this is what needs to happen next. And so in both those cases, both in terms of the language and in terms of the social development, they were judgments, assessments, if you like, made by educators to say, this is at a higher level than I thought it was, or more advanced level, therefore I need to make sure I keep extending it. This social development needs some work and needs support, because actually we need to bring children back to what they understand. So the other really significant or important thing to say at this point is the difference and the distinction between assessment, curriculum and pedagogy. One of the things I'm quite interested in, particularly with a lot of the talk around curriculum, is how these kind of three dimensions get very conflated together in people's minds. And obviously there is an overlap between them. Assessment informs curriculum, and curriculum informs the pedagogy that uses it, and so on, which then goes back into the assessment of children. But it's actually very important to distinguish these out, to be really clear about what we mean by assessment. Certainly for people who use the IEYC, often the assessment has become the curriculum, or outcomes have become the curriculum, and so on. And that kind of blurring of understanding has led to some of the challenges, I think, that we're facing.
But the new development matters makes those explicit, doesn't
yes,
it?
So
within the 7 principles of effective practice, it's absolutely clear, made those three distinct from each other, and uses some of your terminology.
Yes, I'm not taking credit for that. I'm sure Julian was more than aware of that before he came across anything I'd done. And I think that's really important, and I think it's quite interesting that very often there's a far too much of a conflation between, for instance, curriculum and pedagogy. Curriculum is the content, this is the stuff we want children to know. We decide as adults, we decide as a society, this is what we want children to know. Pedagogy is the vehicle by which we do that. It's a really good Chinese proverb, which is, there are many paths to the top of the mountain, but the view is always the same. And I think that, for me, that really sums up, in some ways, good early years practice, because the view is a curriculum. That's this. We want children to have these behaviours, we want to have this knowledge, we want to acquire these skills. We want them to have this kind of understanding, these kind of thinking processes. That's our curriculum, if you like, our outcomes. But how they get there and the routes they take are going to be very, very different. And in a very real way, assessment is part of that, because by tuning into the individual nature of children, we know how to best support that in different ways. And we've had that conversation about the importance of learning from mistakes and getting things wrong. There are some children, individual children, who respond very differently to exactly the same provocation or the same idea. So, I've worked with children, and if you said to them, I bet you can't build a tower that's as tall as me, they will obsessively spend the entire day trying to challenge that. Where other children, if you said exactly the same phrase to, they would just curl in themselves and say, no, I can't do it, and you would have wrecked their day for that. And it's actually, assessment is about knowing which of those children, how you respond to them, how you get the best accuracy. It's a highly, highly skilled process.
you know, in the IEYC, the learning outcomes are there, and you know, the teachers help children progress towards them. So that multiple path analogy of, you know, that you're using is absolutely relevant to the IEYC. You know, the outcomes are there to guide us to where we believe children should be. You know, so the shared vision within the IEYC schools also helps guide us. You know, these are the sort of children that we are seeking to develop, but how we get there, as you said, will look completely different for each child within that class, based upon their interests, their skills, their friends. You know, that can change. You know, the people that they like playing with will introduce them to different concepts. So you know, the IEYC does understand that within the outcomes. We understand that we are progressing towards the outcomes. You know, not every child, as you said, will achieve all of them. Some children will achieve some early, some they may not receive other ones. And understanding that is important as a teacher. That, you know, we're guiding them down those pathways.
I think the bond with the adult as well. I mean, we're talking about, just as you mentioning friendships, actually it's about the connections and bonds in whatever space they're in, but that extends to the practitioners. So some children, if you're talking about assessment, one practitioner might have a completely different relationship with the same child because the bond is different, their connection is different. It's quite mystical, that. Sometimes we don't know why that is, that's human nature. But in terms of assessment, I know I've had conversations with my team about the same child, and they will have completely opposing views of that knowledge of that child, and how important it is to reflect on that, because if that's going to be a barrier to assessment, to taking anybody forward, practitioner and child, you kind of need to be really honest and open about that as well. And for some practitioners, it can be, they can feel like they failed, rather than it just be the honest and thing to say in the moment is, I think you take this one.
Yeah.
This is working here. Cool.
Yeah.
I'll stand back, you know, and that's a really amazing, but sometimes quite mature thing to sort of have to step up and do.
Yeah, but it's also, I think, it raises that issue of the fact that to have a true and authentic picture of the child, you need multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
And it's often the case that children too, they react differently to different adults in a setting. And you're right, you can often have a different view. They're both accurate, but they respond differently. And equally with the views of parents. So parents might say, well, at home, this child does X, Y, Z. And you'll think, well, I've never seen them do that in a setting. Yeah. But that's a question. You say, often when parents would say that to me, I'm thinking, okay, well, why is it? What is it that's happening at home that isn't happening here, that doesn't enable them to demonstrate that? Because now I have a piece of information that says they are competent in that area. And you know, going back to, you know, the kind of discussion we had about COVID, you know, that development in language is quite clearly because of the experiences they've had, and it raises actually quite an uncomfortable question that children would develop, knowing how important development language is. You know, why is that? Why have they made so much progress? Because they haven't been in a setting. And how do we recreate that? How do we reflect that in what we do? So. Again, these are dimensions of the use of assessment information. It's about the child. It's about how you take the child first, but also one of its sort of, you know, secondary uses is the ability to reflect on the effectiveness of your practice. To say, well, you know, this is working really well for this group of children, but there's these group of children who it isn't. So what do I need to do differently? And assessment information sort of gives you that.
And I think, you know, in the IEYC, the, you know, ongoing assessment is through reflective practices. That's been absolutely highlighted by the, you know, learning principle 7, which is about, you know, the reflective practices and ongoing assessment. You know, so it sort of encompasses, reflective practices encompasses that professional dialogue that you have between practitioners, across teaching teams, across teaching grades. I used to have some really good conversations as a nursery teacher with the reception teacher, you know, with parents and obviously with children themselves. You know, children have a right to be involved in their own learning and the direction of their own learning. And you know, I always felt quite keenly as a practitioner that it was my duty to try to involve the children as much as possible, be it through looking at photos, or a journal or a portfolio and getting them to comment, but all, even if I sit down and say, well, what have you been doing? What did you find hard? What will you do next? And as I said, sometimes that would work really well, and other times it didn't. But you still learn something from it.
Absolutely, and I think that comes back to one of the points you made about the quality of that relationship. Because children will reveal that and demonstrate that when they're comfortable, secure, and they have that rapport and that warmth relationship. And that's why, and we'll go on to talk about this in one of the sessions, that the process of how you get that information becomes so critical, because it needs to be authentic, and I think that's something that we'll touch on. So I think, we said the point of assessment is to know that our teaching has been successful, the curriculum's been delivered, that children are making progress, and that what we've done has had an impact and is secure with the children. But also it prompts the question of, simplistically, what do we do next? What do we do with that information? How do we take it forward? So that raises the question, why if assessment is such an intrinsic part of the process of practice, and so interwoven with curriculum pedagogy, do we need to consider assessment separately? I think the answer is yes. What we assess expresses our values of education, and we assess what we think is important. As we've touched on already, when you're watching a child, there are hundreds of possible pieces of learning being demonstrated at any one single moment. So as an educator, we choose what we see. We select the piece or the piece of information that we think is significant, and that is an expression of value. Margaret Carr says, if we assess what we value, if we don't assess what we value, then that gets lost from the curriculum. And actually we need to find ways of assessing the things that are important. I'm paraphrasing her, but that's broadly what she said. It's a really strong statement about saying if we think something is important, we should be assessing it, because if we assess it, then we teach it. If we don't assess it, it becomes lost. So the idea of expressing these values and our perception of learners becomes very, very important. So assessment also defines the curriculum. We assess what we think is important, and what we think is important is shaped by the content of the curriculum, and then enshrouded or enveloped in the pedagogy that goes around it. If we want to really do that, we want to really recognise the uniqueness of learning and the uniqueness of the paths and directions and trajectories children's learning takes, and the interests that they follow, and the kind of experiences they bring to that, and how we work with them and shape them, make them meaningful and real and so on, then we have to really understand that uniqueness. And that uniqueness is through knowing children really well, which again I would define as what we mean by assessment.
And obviously in the IEYC, the second learning principle is absolutely about that, about the fact that children will have unique starting points, will have a unique learning journey through the IEYC. So that concept of assessment, understanding that uniqueness and their interests, their curiosities, enables you to, assessment enables you to capture those and then sort of understand them, interpret them, and then respond to them, as you said, to think about what next when we look at enabling the environment.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's a key part of sort of responding to what you have learnt about the child.
And at that point you were also looking at the family quite often, which we touched on. I'm really interested in the role of a parent in what you've said so far, yeah, but there's so much to say on that. But just in terms of that starting point, actually your knowledge of the family at that point can be, in some contexts, very, very helpful, and in some contexts very, very distracting. So again, it's very unique what you want to know to get a clear view on the child, but it does help to build a picture when you start with them, when you start to get to know them. Just simple things like, have they got siblings, particularly when we talk about language. I think, there's simple kind of factual things which are, really important as starting points. Otherwise you can misplace things.
Yeah, no, actually the sibling one is a really interesting one, because it's quite a recognised phenomenon that if a child has lots of older siblings, their language development, and certainly their verbal language development, may appear to be at an early stage of development because they are used to an environment where they are, where their siblings speak for them. So position in, not always the case, but certainly in some cases, sometimes they have to fight for what they can so much. It could be the other way. Sounds like you're speaking as the younger sibling then.
I'm speaking as a mum of 3.
Right, okay, direct, yeah. But even understanding that information is really important because it provides a context, and I think the idea of a one size fits all or a one image fits all is very dangerous, because you go for the common denominator, and you actually ignore some of the nuance which makes the child who they are, and it's actually understanding that which then enables you to work with them that effectively. So what we could sum up assessment is it's very strongly driven or very strongly connected with curriculum by identifying what is important, we assess what we value, and as creators of a curriculum, we create what we think is important for children to know. So values is a key part of it. We also find out how we get what we need to know. It's providing authentic information, and we'll deal with that in some detail in one of the other sessions. How do we get real information to children? It's not like working with older children where you can ask them direct questions, or you can give them a test or an activity. Children, your very young children in early years, in kindergarten age, don't work in that way. Their perception of the world is significantly different enough for us to be very wary of that. We will come on that. When we do acquire information, it's deciding how we use it, reflecting on it, understanding what kind of examining its authenticity, if you like, and then using it. And again, and we'll keep coming back to this, assessment is only useful as the way in which it's used. Certainly, we moved a little bit, but certainly we have been in a culture, certainly in the UK, where people are assessing because they have to do assessment. And the information they were generating, and especially recording and documenting, was never used in any other way. It was just recorded and kept as a kind of archive, if you like. And I would argue that is the least effective use of the concept of assessment. So all the way along, we are assessing, and a lot of it we do subconsciously because it's through our interaction and we're building that structure of our view of a child, as I said. But certainly when we're recording and we're judging information and we're judging it against criteria, for instance, for a different assessment system, we have to continue to ask ourselves, how am I going to use this? Is this going to inform my practice? Is it going to inform what I know about this individual child, about groups of children? Is it going to inform how I might shape the environment to reflect this or to cater for this? Might it inform how I guide planning or guide the next sort of project or theme that we look at? And if it's not doing that, you have to ask yourself what you're doing it for. So I suppose one of the other issues I'm interested in exploring, and it fits with the sort of holistic way in which we've talked about this and how this is part of practice and part of what we do every day, and part of how it informs our thinking, and a lot of it happens sort of almost subconsciously. It's really the distinction between formative and summative assessment. And certainly there is a narrative of assessment which says, some of the assessment you use is summative, it describes children at a different point in time, and some of it is formative, and it informs what you do next. And although that is a useful paradigm for looking at the nature of assessment, actually I think that's one that we need to challenge, particularly in early years, because I believe and I think that formative and summative assessment is actually the wrong distinction to make. What I think is much more significant is what I would call fine-grained data, fine-grained information, and headline data, which is overall information. Because fundamentally, all assessments are both formative and summative in nature. At any time you make a judgment about a child, whether it's just cognitively in the moment, or it's recorded, or it's against criteria, you are describing that child at a point in time. All those 1,000 interactions and those conversations you have give you information which says at this point in time, this conversation with this child, or this observation of this child, this interaction tells me this, and it summarises a moment in time, so they are summative assessments. But equally, as I've continually said, you then use that information to say, and what next? What does that tell me? What does that help me to understand? How do I use that information? So I would argue every assessment is both formative and summative, intrinsically formative and summative in nature. However, what is different is what I would say fine-grained data and headline data, and that's the distinction. So fine-grained data is about those individual moments of a child's development. A moment in time where you've thrown a publication, asked a question, and so on. Headline data is giving the child overall as a point in time to say, this is what I know about the child as a whole, this is what it tells me, this is how we're going to move forward. But it's a little bit, I wrote about this a couple of years ago as the telescope effect, which is you look at a child from a distance and they might be doing something, or they might be acting in a particular way and engaged in activity, and then you zoom in with your metaphorical telescope to say, I'm going to look at their ability to socialise and to socially cooperate. So in this miasma of activity and demonstrating hundreds of different types of learning at one moment, I zoom in in my telescope effect as fine-grained data to say, I want to know about their ability to socially cooperate. I want to know about their use of language. And it's those two things which I think are far more significant, because as an educator you need to stand back and have the child, view the child as a whole, how all their different component parts interact together, how they act as a person, but also you have to have the ability and the knowledge to zoom in on these very specific things. So I think formative self-assessment is a single entity, but I think you have to be able to zoom in and out, telescope in and out to get true authenticity of what you understand about children.
I mean, in Taveriki they talk about foregrounding and backgrounding, and sort of, within any assessment, even if you're planning an assessment opportunity, you can say, I'm going to foreground their language use. So yes, I know that they're going to be operating across the strands, but all I'm going to focus on is their language use within this activity. So that I always found that quite useful as a practitioner, to think, what am I going to foreground within this activity? What actually am I going to look at?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think good knowledge of a child, which you build on time, gives you the candidates, if you like, for what that foregrounding should be. So people often, one thing we'll go to talk about this when we talk about recording, is to say, the question isn't how much information have I got written down, it's how well do you know the child. And sometimes when you're thinking about children that you work with, you might suddenly realise that actually I'm not sure if I know about their social development. And that's the point where you would foreground. You would say, well, I'm going to observe them over the next period of time. I'm going to make sure I keep logging checking in with them to actually look at their social development, because that's a bit of my knowledge that's missing. That's a bit of the puzzle, the mosaic that's missing. Certainly in the UK, as I've said already, I would say over-recording and an over-reliance on written, videoed, photographed information. So the first thing you can say is recording and documenting is not assessment. Assessment is knowing and understanding children. Recording and documenting is something you sometimes need to do, and it's a professional judgment. It does have a purpose. I'm not saying you should never record and document, but I'm saying you have to be very careful about when you do it and what you record, and to be very self-critical and analytical about what that information does and why it needs to be recorded. And certainly in the past few years it has got better, though. I think there was a point where we did lose sight of that, people recording, documenting everything, and certainly with the advent of digital technology and its sort of incorporation into mainstream educational provision, we saw this plethora of hundreds of media files and photographs and video clips, And as with any spectrum of quality versus quantity, the more there were, I would argue, certainly in my anecdotal experience, the less quality there were. So we need to be clear that recording and documenting is not assessment. Assessment is knowing and understanding children. But we do need to explore records and documents and see where it looks. So, what do we record and document? Yes, we do need to record and document, but we need to be careful about how we do it. So we record for our own information, and that's a very important principle. Anything you record as an educator is for you as a professional. It is a professional judgment and a professional piece of information that is acquired by you in order to do your job as effectively as possible. It does have secondary uses to inform parents, to look at accountability and progress, but it's primarily a professional tool to understand why you're doing and the impact of what you're doing. So, examples, be familiar with different kinds of recording, documentation.
Post-it notes.
Post-it notes.
I used to find those all the time in my pocket. Yeah.
Absolutely. Do they have a role? Absolutely, but they need to be in context. You might have images of children which are annotated, and you might show a child doing something and then describe what's happened in that, and we'll go on to talk about that. Again, key principles here are how does that help me understand that child and do my job as effectively as possible. So there are huge amounts of opportunities for recording and documenting, but we need to be careful how we use them. So, some key points. Assessment is an ongoing process. You are continually assessing. Each of those 1,000 interactions is an assessment. It gives you a piece of information or reinforcing information which constructs that view of the child or understanding of the child. Early as teachers, early as educators are assessing, getting to know the children all the time. So you are constantly assessing, and that's really important to understand that's how you inform what you do. Recording and documentation, while valuable and has a role, is not assessment. You can have lots and lots of written, recorded things and not know the children at all. You can have absolutely nothing and know the children really well. And it's the knowing the children really well which makes you an effective practitioner, teacher or educator. Knowing and understanding the children you work with is more important than having records. Having records plays a role, we can explore that, but it's the knowing and understanding that is really important. Key questions you ask yourself if you are recording and documenting. Key things you need to consider. Is it needed? Is it really needed? And if so, what's it needed for? Who's going to look at it? Who's going to use it? And how often and at what significance is that going to play a role? So if you're recording something, who's going to read that and who's going to use that? And if the answer to that question isn't you, then you need to look very carefully at why you're doing it, because what you're then effectively doing is stopping teaching and interaction in order to record something for somebody else. And that, I think, is a very acute tension in what you're doing. The role of the educator is not to do things for other people, it's to support children and support their learning. So anything that gets in the way of that has to be looked at very carefully. How does it help me know the children I work with? Does it help you to do that? And how does it help you to do your job? So those are the questions you need to ask if you are about to record something. So, another consideration, when you stop an interaction to record and document, crucial moments of learning and teaching can be lost. And I, certainly as an advisor and a consultant, I often used to see this in situations where something really intense is happening and the children are talking to you, to the educator, and the educators are talking back to them, and there's this really high, intense, high level of involvement. Really you can see the dendrites fizzing and buzzing, and they go and get an iPad to and in that moment, that momentum just seeps away. You can physically see it. And had they not reached for the iPad, that would have gone on and sustained itself. So there is a real judgment here. Often, I think practitioners, educators need to just consider what will be lost when I stop this interaction. is what the recording of this more important than the learning that is taking place and the support I'm giving those people? So when you stop, now sometimes that is important because these things are significant, I'll come into that in a minute, but that is a really strong professional call. When you make a judgment about a child's learning and development, this is a professional decision that derives from a range of sources of information, very little of which will be recorded. So, if you're recording something for the purposes, particularly of accountability, you're recording it for the purposes of describing where a child is at a point in time, particularly if you're using that against a particular criteria. For example, if you're in reception using EYFS, the EYFS profile, for example, you judge your knowledge of the child against the criteria. When you're doing that, that's a professional decision. When you make that decision, you pull together everything you know about that child. Most of that is not written down. Most of what you know about the children you work with is not written down, and it's impossible to do that. So you need to make sure that you draw upon that as evidence. And we talk about what's your evidence for knowing what children know. Well, your evidence is not necessarily recorded. Your evidence is having those conversations day in, day out with those children. It builds up that picture, and we have to be really clear that that constitutes evidence of what you know.
You bring up about that professional sort of decision that you make about your knowledge of the child. I always found that actually I really understood the children when I was talking to other people. You know, that sort of, I found that professional dialogue really drove my understanding of the child, because, you know, we talked about different perspectives. You know, I would always view someone with what I think they term as my gaze. You would obviously look at them with your gaze. You would look at them with your gaze. You know, and obviously we, you know, in the IEYC we capture sort of information about the children and then we interpret it. And I think it's important to stress the interpreting is a sort of collaborative approach, because, you know, what I see. The fine-grained data that I see, or the fine-grained information that I see, will be different from you and different from you. You know, so I think it's important to highlight that. You know, dialogue should be encouraged about children. You know, and as you said before, with parents, with children themselves.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things actually. I mean, that's triggered for me. One is Mary Jane Drummond's quote about the importance of understanding what we see, because. You're right, we all view it through our own individual personal lens, and actually that's part of observational assessment, is, you know, what we bring to that, and what we sometimes assume, you know. In assessment, so often people talk about the halo effect and the demon effect. And the halo effect is if a child is really good at simplifying it massively, apologies to experts on it. Halo effect is basically saying if a child is really good at something, we cognitively assume they're good at other things as well. So as we watch them, we kind of we gear our judgment towards a more positive end, because they're, you know, and it affects the way we think. And similarly, the demon effect is if a child is at a very early stage of development, we subconsciously assume that affects other things as well, and it can affect our judgment. So understanding what we see and being able to unpick that is really important. And I think the second thing you said, which I think is perhaps not as recognised and should be, is that collaborative nature of it. Because I think if you, and that when you said, I understand children best when I'm talking about them, someone else, actually that's a really patent statement, because it is, because other people give you, either reinforce that perspective or they give you a different perspective, and it kind of again reshapes what you finally see, and that's how we get to authenticity, I think.
Something I used to do as a practitioner was I got stickers made that said "Ask me about."
Yes.
And I used to just write. So if something significant had happened, I would literally just write "Ask me about my plane," and stick it on their chest. So when they went home, the parent would know, oh, I need to ask the child about their plane. And it took a bit of training with the parents for them to understand, why is my kid coming home covered, you know, with a sticker on. But once we trained, you know, it began as it sort of stimulated those conversations, not only between myself and the parent, but also between the parent and the child. And it gave the child a chance to reflect back on significant moments, maybe not significant to them, but significant that I had made a judgment that was significant. and it worked. It was manageable, which was inevitably which is difficult.
No, that's a really good technique, and again it empowers the parent to be able to see that moment of the child's, because of the child's life that is significant to them, and they can talk about it. Because sometimes with children, if you ask a question that's too open-ended, that they can't connect with it. So if a parent says, "Well, what have you done today?" It's they've done too much. They've done too
nothing.
much. I can't. I've played
nothing.
Exactly. But you're right. If you can narrow that down to say, "Oh, did you make an aeroplane today, or did you draw a picture of a wolf?" Immediately for them it's, "Oh yes, I did," and you have that avenue of conversation. But I think the answer to your question is it's a question of impact and manageability, and there will always be a bell curve of where that sits, and I think that again that's one of the professional decisions that you come to. I want to really sum up recording documentation into 3 principles, because it is an issue, and it does challenge us, and it has been something that's been systemic. I would argue over documentation, and ineffective documentation has been systemic in the community, certainly in the UK. So I would say there are 3 principles about recording and documenting. I think if you're cognizant of these, then that should sort of guide the judgments you make. So first thing is, you record a document what you need to clarify your knowledge of the child. So we know children are complex learners, and sometimes as we've touched already with both of you, sometimes we have to get under the skin of that and say, well, what does that really tell us? So sometimes you might need to record what the child is doing, so you've got a basis in which to reflect. So that might be something written, it might be something recorded, it might be a photograph with annotation and so on. But it's a point of reference to say, actually, what does that tell me about the child? And particularly children who it's challenging to get under the skin of what they do. One of the things I often talk about is invisible children. In your classroom you have a group of children, and some of them are invisible. And I always say to practitioners, if you want to know who your invisible children are, write from memory all the children in your class, and you'll get to the last 2 at the end and think, who am I missing? Oh, it's so and so and so and so. Those are your invisible children. So those are children who kind of slip through the cracks a little bit. You have your ones who are very articulate and who are very who overshare lots of information. They're talking to you all the time. You have other children who you're very conscious of because they're perhaps at an early stage of development, and you're very conscious of supporting them. And in the middle are these children who are your invisible ones. And sometimes those are the children who lose out because they often quite they get on with things. They're quite engaged with things. They don't necessarily present themselves in that way, and sometimes you have to take that extra step to say, okay, what do I know about those 2 children? What do I know about that child's social development or language and so on? And you have to target them. And sometimes when you do that, you might need to record that because it's an important reference point. But that again. Also, you maybe record what is significant for individual children. We go right back to the purpose of assessment, individual conversations, 1,000 interactions a day. You get to know those children really well. When you're watching them, they're doing hundreds of different things. You know which of those things is or isn't significant. And sometimes there are moments in children's day where you think, no, I need to record that. That's a real moment. They've done something or not done something that's highly significant for them. Today's a mark, so that's part of that. And most of all, you record what you're going to forget. I know from being an early years teacher that a million different things happen in one day. Sometimes I remember as a nursery teacher, when it got to lunchtime, if I could remember my own name, it was a good day. So there's all this information flooding about, and sometimes significant things happen. You think, I've got to remember that, and that's about scribbling a word and a child's name and a word, just as an aide memoir to say this thing happened. It's really significant. The one anecdote I remember, and this is from working with a child, which is now, this is a while ago since I've been in the classroom, but I remember it really clearly. A child who had certainly appeared to have very low levels of language development. And he'd been in the outdoor area, and he came in with what he said was a dinosaur bone. He was imagining it, well, he hadn't really found one. he went to the telephone, and he picked up the telephone, and then he started having a conversation with someone he said was from the British Museum. Now, the conversation was so authentic that at one point I thought, has he actually got through to the British Museum? Because he was having this really in-depth discussion. It could be a Triceratops because of this. It was long, so it could be a Velociraptor. It could be, and he was having this incredible language about dinosaurs and about the meta language and the context of the understanding of dinosaurs. And I just wrote I wrote his name, and I just wrote dinosaurs telephone. Those are the only 2 words I wrote. Now, even now, years later, that just those 2 words triggers that memory very, very directly. So sometimes, and those are notes for yourself, it's to remember this thing happened and it was really big. And just for that day, sometimes at the end of the session, you might have, I don't know, 2 or 3 of those notes to yourself about things that happened. So record and document what you think you might forget, and that changes over time.
You should not break off interactions with children. That is your job. You should give careful consideration to how you choose to record your observations, to make sure that it does not limit the scope of your interactions, the number or the quality of the interactions. And more importantly, just as we've said, knowing children is not based on the number of bits of paper you have in a folder. The IEYC does not recommend a certain number of observations per day, per month, per week, for each child. It is about you knowing your children, and that is the thing that will not only support children's development, but will guide your planning and enable you to respond in an appropriate manner to each child and their learning pathways, their interests, their emerging talents. As you said, if you talk to early years teachers, they will go on for a long time because they know the children so well. And that is not based on how many pieces of paper they have. In pieces of paper can be useful, but that is not the main criteria for knowing a child.
Absolutely.
Well, I'd just like to say thank you to Jan and Nora for the end of this first webinar. I hope you've all found it very useful. We'll see you again for the second one.